Is there any point in studying the theology of a fictional universe? Of course there is, and here is why. Warhammer 40k is probably the most impactful fictional universe in the world. While the cultural phenomenon began as a tabletop game, the franchise has grown to include books, animated films, and video games. Warhammer 40k encompasses a grim future where humanity struggles to survive amidst endless war. The universe embodies a mixture of science fiction, religious imagery, historical references, and occult ideas. The Imperium of Man is an extremely intolerant religious state whose ruler is a dying god. Its enemies are no less twisted. They include demon worshippers, space elves whose souls may be devoured by the god they themselves created, an ancient mechanical race suffering from a severe form of dementia, orcs that reproduce by spores, and a hive mind that consumes entire galaxies. But the most interesting aspect of Warhammer 40k is its theology. From the moment I noticed Warhammer 40k book covers painted with recognizable Byzantine-style icons, this universe became my constant subject of reflection. Which saints are depicted on the armor? What do they refer to? That small artistic detail became the reason I began to look at Warhammer as a complex and, in many ways, unique theological system. There's no Christian god in this setting, yet there is a Trinity. This is one of the few fictional worlds where the material realm dominates the immaterial one. There is no Christianity in Warhammer, but, just as in Christianity, the main symbol of hope is a tortured man. It weaves together ideas from occultism, Islam, Gnosticism, and the ideologues of the French Revolution. In the end, I came to the conclusion that the central figure of this universe, the God Emperor of mankind, is built around the same conflict faced by one of the most obscure Christian heresies. In this video, I will try to show that the God Emperor is not a single character, but two characters with an ontological conflict between them. This video will not be easy to digest, but it will definitely help you see the setting in a different light. I'm proposing a very different, deeper, and more exotic level of analysis of this universe. Enjoy watching.
Slings of fear.
This is only the second video on this channel, and I spent many months creating it, so your engagement is incredibly important. I understand that it is strange to ask this at the beginning of the video, but if at some point while watching you feel that you like it, please do not forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Likes are not that important, but I read every single comment. Alright, let's continue. Every religion in the world answers two key questions. How did everything begin? And how can one be saved? The first question eventually leads to the creation of cosmology, that is, a myth about the creation and structure of the universe. The second question leads to eschatology, which is the part of theology that concerns the afterlife and the final fate of the material world. When we discuss Warhammer 40k, we need to understand that the answers to both key questions are radically different from those of the more familiar religions of our world. Therefore, it is natural to begin with the cosmology of Warhammer. There are three main features that distinguish this universe, not only from other fictional settings, but also from other mythological and religious systems in general. Imagine our universe in the 40th millennium. Gothic science fiction, darkness, religious hysteria, and a complete absence of hope. This world is divided into two key parts. On one side is the materium, the tangible universe familiar to us. On the other side is the immaterium, a non-material plane of existence called the warp. In Warhammer, the warp is the home of terrifying beings, demons, and gods that stand beyond human understanding. Because it is the main way to travel the galaxy, the warp is unavoidable. The first key feature of this setting is that the material world comes first. In most classic religions, the world we live in is secondary or even dependent on the spiritual realm. This world might be born from the immaterial, as it is in many pagan myths, or the material plane of existence might simply be just another turn in an endless cycle. In some more exotic systems, our world is only somebody's dream or imagination. You can find such ideas in Indian cosmology or in Sufi Islam. Or, for instance, in Lovecraft's Cosmology, the material world is the dream of Azathoth and exists only while he sleeps, which is why he is constantly kept asleep by music. But what is even more important is this. In such systems, the material world does not have any significant influence on the spiritual one. The material world can be destroyed, reborn, saved, forgotten, or renewed, but the beings born within it are unable to change the immaterial plane of existence. Communication is possible, change is not. The universe of Warhammer is different. The material world and the life within it did not arise from the immaterial at the command of some deity. Eldar mythology suggests that these are two artificially separated parts of what was once a single whole. However, the interaction between them is quite unexpected. Originally, the warp was not the home of any intelligent entities. All gods, demons, and other entities appeared within the warp solely as a reaction to the psychic activity of living material beings. The idea that the combined psychic activity of groups of people can give rise to personified immaterial organisms is a relatively recent innovation from the 19th century. Among the first to formulate this idea were the Soviet philosopher and geologist Vladimir Vernadsky, the French paleontologist and Catholic Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and the French mathematician Édouard Leroy. Their work strongly influenced one another, and together they arrived at the concept of the noosphere. In simple terms, reason becomes a cosmic force that is capable of transforming natural processes. During the biosphere stage, the Earth and life on it were subject only to the laws of nature. But at the stage of the noosphere, humanity is, in a sense, able to establish new laws and bend reality through the power of knowledge and thoughts. For Vernadsky, the noosphere did not have a mystical meaning. He primarily saw it as a stage in the development of ethics and as a word of collective human knowledge. De Chardin and Leroy, however, understood it more as a process of becoming united with God. They believed that the development of the universe is a movement from matter towards spirit. In their view, the growth of reason was not just the growth of technology, it was a movement of the whole human race toward higher unity. Teilhard called this highest point of unity Omega, and believed that it is the same as God. His idea was that the human mind somehow steps beyond matter, becomes something single and separate from the biosphere, changes it, and then unites with God. This order of events is very similar to the warps, where a connection to its energy can change reality. The word noosphere is even used directly in Warhammer, although its meaning is a bit different. It is funny that Warhammer's warp is much closer to the noosphere from Stalker than to Vernadsky's actual ideas. Esoteric thinkers such as René Guénon, Peter Carroll, and Blavatsky developed a similar idea. They believe that the shared actions of people who are united by one idea and one will can create immaterial beings, a new kind of collective mind. Unlike the noosphere, these beings possess something that resembles personality and will. They called these beings egregores. In the minds of esoteric thinkers, these egregores are almost individuals. Separate egregores can exist for nations, religions, philosophical schools, football teams, and many other things. From the viewpoint of these writers, even this video will have its own egregore if enough people watch it. The more people join an egregore, the stronger its collective mind becomes, and the more it can influence the material world. Unlike the noosphere, egregores are viewed practically. Esotericists and occultists believe that a person can connect to them, almost like connecting to a wireless network, and then interact with them, even using them for personal means. A very direct version of this idea can be seen in the manga and anime Chainsaw Man. Every phenomenon from hurricanes to aging to firearms exists there in the form of a corresponding egregore, also known as a devil. But the author goes further and makes this link work in both directions. If such a being is completely destroyed, the real phenomenon also disappears. For example, when the being of hearing was destroyed, everyone lost their ears. So if you were sad about some of these beings dying, you can relax. They're not truly gone as long as the things they represent still exist. Don't thank me. Careful viewers will notice a link here with pagan religions, where gods are both the rulers of certain forces and those forces themselves. That is why in the original God of War games, when Kratos kills the gods of Olympus, the world around him starts to fall apart. Sadly, this idea was mostly lost in later games, but I digress. The warp's inner workings within Warhammer overlap very closely with these two concepts. The warp is depicted as a separate plane of existence, similar to the noosphere. Within it, egregores are born from the combined thoughts and emotions of living beings. The vast majority of entities in the warp are minor beings with no real influence at all, but some of them become so powerful that it is hard to call them anything other than gods. Let me add a quick note. In this video, I use a broad meaning of the word God. By God, I mean a single being that is powerful enough to alter reality within a certain range around itself. Divinity is a spectrum. The more a being can change reality, and the larger the area that falls under this change, the more that being is a god. Even within Warhammer, the word God is used for lack of a better alternative in human language. Other fractions in Warhammer 40k likely have better words. It simply happens to be a convenient label for describing a complex phenomenon. For similar reasons, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used the word Hades to denote the realm of the dead, which is not identical to Gehenna or Tartarus. Yes, these are different things. In Warhammer, beings that live in the material world create their own gods simply by existing. If living creatures fight a lot, a god of blood and slaughter appears in the warp as a reflection. If they lie, decay, or give themselves over to desire, those emotions also take form. Any strong and concentrated emotion receives its own projection in the warp. Collective emotions of immense power have led to the birth of the so-called Chaos Gods. They are reflections of the strongest and most common emotions and psychic activities of human beings, and their domains are not necessarily limited to negative emotions. This is a fairly old element of the lore, but it is assumed that the Chaos Gods also encompass those aspects of their domains that we would consider positive. For example, slaughter exists side by side with martial honor. Emotions, like gods, exist on a spectrum. The gods of the warp are not natural. They are closer to an anomaly. perversions, or even a disease. We can easily see that demons look unnatural when they enter the material world. They cannot exist there for long without a host. What is less obvious is that chaos gods are also unnatural inside the warp itself, even though they were born and live there. The reason is simple. The warp is a place without order, but the chaos gods are a form of order. They have personality, emotions, goals, domains, servants, and their own realms. These realms even have hierarchy and borders. For an observer from the material world, those borders may look vague or impossible to grasp, yet even in that form, they are unnatural inside the warp. And because they are not meant to exist, without a constant flow of emotion from the material world, the chaos gods would simply fade away. This creates a rather ironic situation. The inhabitants of the material world have literally infected the spiritual plane with something as unpleasant as self-aware consciousness. I want to stress that I cannot recall any other cosmology that works in quite the same way. Although it is worth emphasizing that this is mainly my theological interpretation and not an established fact of the lore. The thing with the closest resemblance to the warp is the concept of the so-called Library of Babel. This may sound like a strange digression from the main topic, but I promise this analogy for the warp is worth listening to. So, a short story titled Library of Babel was written in 1941 by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. It was published as a fictional essay and paints a unique picture, the Library of Babel. However, the word Babel here means something universal and endless. The library is made of hexagonal-shaped rooms. In each room, there are 20 shelves. On every shelf, there are 32 books. Every book has 410 pages. Each page has 40 lines. Each line has about 80 black letters. Only 25 symbols exist. There are 22 letters, a period, a comma, and a space. There are no numbers and no capital letters. No two books are fully the same, but the library contains every possible combination of letters in every possible book. If you calculate the total number of books, it turns out that the size of the library exceeds the volume of the observable universe by about 10 to the 611,338th. The overwhelming majority of books in the library are, of course, meaningless. They are only filled with random sets of symbols. But at the same time, somewhere among the countless shelves, there are all the texts that humanity has created or will ever create, even those that will never be written. For example, the library may contain the history of the future, the autobiography of the archangels, the Gnostic Gospel of Valacita, a commentary on it, a commentary on the commentary, the lost works of Tacitus, any secret unredacted documents, a true catalog of the entire library, and also a proof that this catalog is false. The warp works similarly. It is like the Library of Babel, but instead of letters, it contains every possible form of psychic energy, every echo of thought, and every soul. Unlike the library in the story, the warp is always moving and changing, as if the letters in the books were to never cease rearranging themselves. The only thing that can consolidate anything inside the warp, even for a short time, is a strong and steady flow of similar emotions from living beings in the material world. It is as if a book in the library only becomes stable when someone is reading it, and its contents changed depending on what the reader felt. It is also interesting that one Warhammer novel mentions the Akashic Records. This is another variety of library that contains all events, thoughts, words, emotions, and intentions that ever existed in the past, present, or future. There is one important catch in the idea that warp gods are born from the emotions of living beings. This description suggests that the beings of the warp did not exist before they were born. That is not quite how things work in Warhammer, and this brings us to the second important feature of the setting. There is no concept of linear time in the warp. The books describe an important demon named Samus. He plays a major role in the story of this universe. Samus appears very early in the series. From the way he speaks, it is clear that he is extremely ancient and has existed in the material world for thousands of years before the main events of the story begin. But the event that actually caused his birth happens only 60 books later. The key idea is this: once a being appears on the warp, they have always existed there. And once it exists in the warp, the being can even manifest in the material world long before the date of its formal creation. This feature of the cosmology may not look important at first glance, but I would argue that it explains a great deal about the motivations of many Warhammer characters, so it's worth keeping in mind for later. Take note. The third essential part of Warhammer's cosmology is not stated as clearly as the previous two, but it is just as important. This is the idea of cognitive contamination. We've already seen how the material world creates the beings that live in the warp, but how do these beings pass from the immaterial world into the material one? In order to do that, they need belief. In many fantasy stories, faith and worship are the main source of a god's power. This is the case in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, or in the Elder Scrolls video game series. And when people talk about Warhammer, there is a common opinion that the power of the Chaos Gods also depends directly on how many followers they have. I would argue that this is not quite correct. Warp entities are primarily fueled by emotions and psychic activity, not by belief itself. The Chaos Gods manifested and became powerful long before anyone began to worship them. Even if all their followers died, the gods would not disappear as long as they were fed with emotions. The Chaos Gods need followers for two distinct reasons. First, followers are useful as long as their actions strengthen the emotion that each Chaos God is based on.
I choose you.
Second, followers serve as a window that allows warp beings to enter the material world. The danger of the warp is that it can easily start a cult. An entire planet can fall to a demonic invasion by simply acknowledging that the warp exists. This kind of knowledge spreads like cognitive hazards. The easiest way to explain what this means is with one sentence. You are now breathing manually. Breathing is something that normally happens in the background, without conscious effort, but after hearing this phrase, many people suddenly begin to control every breath, and it's not easy to switch this back off. In a moment, I will give a few more examples of cognitive contamination, so if this is a sensitive topic for you, now is a good time to look at the timestamps. I know for certain that some people react to this very badly, and in rare cases, it can even trigger panic attacks. Well, I warned you, so let's continue. Look at this image. This is a classic example of a cognitive hazard. The picture shows instructions for how a person can dislocate their own finger. When you look at it, the process seems quite simple, although it really isn't. I would not recommend anyone try it. What matters is that once you've seen this picture, there is a high likelihood that you will remember it occasionally whether you want to or not. Another cognitive hazard is Rocco's basilisk. This is a thought experiment. People are asked to imagine that, in the future, a powerful and malevolent artificial intelligence exists. This intelligence can punish those who knew about the possibility of its creation, but did not help bring it into existence. Have you imagined it? Well then, now you know that such an intelligence might appear one day, which means that from this moment, you are already at risk. And if you also believe that the universe is infinite and constantly expanding, then there is an infinite chance that such an intelligence will eventually appear. In other words, you're cooked.
How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
Some of you in the pot may also remember the fictional character called the King in Yellow, who works similarly to Rocco's Basilisk. I won't go into a detailed description of it here, it's better to read the original short story collection yourself. After all, many of you have probably already seen the video on Wendigoon's channel. Within Warhammer, there is even a character who also calls himself the King in Yellow, but this is a different entity, not identical to the original. So, what does Warhammer have to do with all this? The point is that, in the Warhammer universe, simple knowledge of the existence of the immaterial world can already be seen as a cognitive hazard. The more widely this knowledge spreads, the more often living beings interact with it, and the weaker the barrier between the two worlds becomes. This, in turn, leads to an exponential increase in the chance that warp entities will break into the real world. If we keep this in mind, the comparison between the warp and the Library of Babel starts to make even more sense. In the material world, knowledge of the warp creates intention. Intention creates emotion, intention and emotion then create or feed life within the warp. In this way, knowledge becomes the source of life. This kind of knowledge becomes a bullet that can only be stopped by physically eliminating every potential carrier of this knowledge from the material world. At this stage, we have outlined the basic principles of Warhammer's cosmology. We have established that the material world is primary. We have seen how time works in the warp. We've understood cognitive hazards. The features I've listed are not a complete description of Warhammer's cosmology, but they give a clear idea of how it differs from other cosmologies at the most basic level. And this distinction is what shapes the approach I take in the analysis that follows. Now that we have defined the cosmology of the universe, it is time to talk about eschatology. In other words, how can the beings of the material world possibly be saved from such a hostile environment? The bearer of the answer to this question is the central figure of Warhammer 40k, the God Emperor of mankind. Here I run into a problem. Since this is only the second video on my channel, I have no clear idea of what kind of audience I have gathered, or how deeply any of you may already know the Warhammer lore. So I will briefly explain who the Emperor is and what role he plays in this setting, so that we're all on the same page. If you already know the lore well, you can use the timestamps to skip this section. Alright, so the Emperor is an extremely powerful psyker, or someone who can influence reality through the power of his mind. There are many such people among the human race in the Warhammer universe, but the Emperor of humanity is the most powerful of them. He was born several thousand years before the birth of Christ, and he personally destroyed the Tower of Babel. Throughout humanity's history, the Emperor has secretly acted in the background. From time to time, he appeared as one of the historical figures that we know. Unfortunately, we can only speculate about which historical personalities the Emperor might have been. It is more or less established that the Emperor guided humanity in the role of Alexander the Great. Beyond that, fans also point to figures such as Caesar, Washington, and so on. Fan speculations are endless. At some point, humanity reached the peak of its development. It began to conquer the stars, terraform planets, and generally enrich the galaxy with its culture. This period was called the Dark Age of Technology, and it lasted from the 15th to the 25th millennium. Its decline was caused by two events. First came the uprising of artificial intelligence, which gravely weakened and devastated humanity. Second came the onset of warp storms, which engulfed the entire galaxy and made interstellar travel nearly impossible. Human colonies were isolated from one another for 5,000 years, a period that became known as the Age of Strife. Around the same time, a new Chaos God was born in the Warp. The Eldar, the local space elves, sank too deeply into hedonism and arrogance. As a result, their collective desire for perversion led to the birth of Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess in the Immaterium. Slaanesh consumed the souls of the Eldar, destroying most of the species. The birth of this deity also created the Eye of Terror, a rift where the warp overlaps with the material world. And yet, this same event brought the warp storms to an end, making the reunification of humanity possible once again. By the 13th millennium, the Emperor of Humanity once again stepped out of the shadows. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, he began to act openly. He took the title of the sole master of mankind, united Earth and the solar system, and began the Great Crusade to reunify humanity. To achieve this, the Emperor created 20 Primarch sons, and assigned 20 legions of Astartes to each of them. Astartes, also called Space Marines, are super soldiers created through the gene seed of their Primarchs. They are taller, stronger, and far more resilient than ordinary people. Their lifespan is endless, unless it is cut short by war. Unfortunately, because of the actions of the Chaos Gods, the Emperor lost his Primarch sons during their births, and the capsules with them were scattered across the galaxy. Therefore, the Great Crusade was not only about uniting humanity into one Imperium, but also about searching for the Emperor's lost children. Near the end of the Crusade, the Emperor returned to Earth and transferred command to one of his sons, Horus. The Emperor's goal at this stage was to recreate the Webway, an ancient alternative method of space travel composed of a network of passages unconnected to the warp. It is a kind of separate artificial dimension. In theory, an entire species could be moved inside it. This would deprive the Chaos Gods of access to humanity and to its mental energy.
You betrayed me. You betrayed Aethelwulf.
But Horus, in turn, fell under the influence of the Chaos Gods. Horus betrayed his father, turned half of the Primarchs and their legions against him, began a rebellion known as the Horus Heresy, tried to siege Earth, and finally lost in a tragic duel with the Emperor. It may seem that humanity won, but the conflict caused enormous damage. Entire legions were nearly annihilated, and some turned to the side of chaos. Some Primarchs died, some became demons, some disappeared, and that does not even include the billions of ordinary people who were killed. The Emperor himself was mortally wounded and was placed on the Golden Throne, an artifact that doubles as humanity's last hope and a torture device for its user. Upon the throne, the Emperor held back the hordes of demons from invading Earth and maintained the light of the Astronomicon. This is a kind of beacon whose light can be seen even in the warp. It makes interstellar travel through warp possible and remains the last ray of hope for the Imperium of Man. The Emperor has remained in this state for 10,000 years, slowly dying, unable to directly rule humanity, suffering constantly, and devouring thousands of human psychers every day in order to keep the throne functioning. Even during the Emperor's lifetime, cults regularly emerged that deified his person. After his ascension to the throne, and as time passed, a whole religion and totalitarian church grew around him. And this is not without reason, because even in such a state, the Emperor works miracles, and his followers use faith to banish demons. Thus, humanity intended to escape the material world through the Webway in order to deprive the Chaos Gods of the emotional and psychic energy of humankind. But since this plan failed, the only way left for humanity to save itself is to rely on faith in the God Emperor, a faith that people themselves created without the blessing of their own supposed deity. This 5-minute summary gives a very brief synopsis of the setting that I need for further theological analysis of the universe. I have intentionally left out many details and made many generalizations. For example, I did not mention that 2 of the Primarch's sons were erased from Imperial history together with their legions. The summary of the setting is intentionally simplified. Please keep that in mind when you criticize this segment of the video. Unlike many other divine figures in fictional universes, the Emperor is a dynamic character. He develops not only within the current timeline of the setting, but his past also shifts and expands as new books and new editions of the tabletop game are released. Ironically, from a narrative point of view, the Chaos Gods are much more stable figures than the Emperor.
God Emperor, give unto me your strength. Forgive my weakness.
As with many other things in Warhammer, this constant change is very unusual for a key character, especially if that character is a god. Eru Iluvatar in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is, from beginning to end, the creation of a single author. He is internally consistent and functions as a constant. The creator in the Dragon Age series is the product of several writers, but even there, he is not under constant revision from the outside. In short, if a work has an omnipotent deity, it usually serves as the foundation of the universe, not as the main active character. We've already seen why Warhammer's cosmology should be understood differently from what we are used to. Now it is time to see why the God Emperor should not be analyzed in the usual way we analyze divine figures. As with the cosmology of this universe, we need to set aside our Abrahamic lens. Structurally, the Emperor is much closer not to a monotheistic god, but to Odin. Let me explain what I mean. Because there was no single written canon for all the northern pagans, followers of Odin had to constantly reinvent their religion. As a result, Odin absorbed traits that are unexpected and difficult to combine at first glance. For example, Odin is at the same time god of warlike courage, of war itself, a poet, a sage, and also a warlock. The last part clashes with the rest because among the northern peoples, only women were supposed to practice magic. Only they could constantly draw out the main source of magical power from men. I expect a like and a comment from anyone clever enough to guess what that means. Let's see how many of you are out there. So when, in the surviving poem known as Lokasenna, Odin is accused by Loki of having lived with men while taking the form of a woman, the Allfather does not deny it. He does not say that it is false. He is simply annoyed that Loki started airing other people's dirty laundry in public. Actually, nowhere in the poem is it said that Loki ever lied about the other gods during the poem. This feature of Odin does not diminish him in the eyes of his followers because human morality does not apply to gods. This does not mean that Odin was written this way from the start. This complexity emerged over time because various local cults in Scandinavia interpreted him differently. Their myths later mixed. In the end, we received a complex figure with interesting traits and attributes.
Hey, I got some places to be.
The Emperor's character developed similarly. At first, he was created for the tabletop game as a concentrated symbol of the setting's grimness and moral grayness. Later, talented writers interpreted his personality and motivation diversely in the novels. The result was an extremely contradictory figure with clashing motives and goals. On the one hand, he is a militant atheist who cannot stand religion in any form. On the other hand, he is perfectly willing to use religious imagery, symbols, and motifs. Here's another contradiction. He is a god who can work miracles in different corners of the galaxy, yet, at the same time, he is nailed to his throne with no way to speak directly to his subjects and no way to rule his own state. Finally, even though the Emperor is treated as a god by his followers, it's never clearly stated what he is the god of. It is not obvious what emotion or domain he draws his power from. Now, moving forward, we're going to attempt to untangle these contradictions one by one. So here's the first important contradiction. The Emperor is an extremely powerful human being, and at the same time, he is an extremely powerful god. But the human Emperor and the God Emperor are two different subjects who conflict with one another. For fans of the universe, this will probably sound like a stark claim, something close to heresy, so it needs a solid justification. To do that, I will need to rely on Christian theology. One of the most controversial questions between Christian churches was the question of the two natures and two wills of Christ. For example, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholics follow the doctrine of diatheletism. This means that they recognize two wills in Christ, a human and a divine one, which are in full harmony with one another. In contrast, the Monothelites believe that though Christ has two natures, there is only one will, and they are the ones who help explain our analysis of the Emperor. So let's stop here for a moment. Monothelites believed that the will of Christ did not belong to either of his two natures, but to his single person. This distinction may seem small, but the Monothelites' reasoning was quite serious. They assumed that if Christ has two wills, then they must inevitably come into conflict. From the Monothelite point of view, the human nature and human will of Christ, if treated as separate, will not want to suffer and die in pain. In addition to that, they believe that human nature itself was damaged by the fall and therefore could not fully align with the divine will. From this, they concluded that if you isolate a distinct human will in Christ, then either it must be subordinate to the divine will, or it should not exist as a separate will at all, and there must be something else instead. This is the position the Monothelites reached. Later, after long debates, this view was condemned as heresy, as they deemed that such an interpretation reduced the fullness of Christ's human nature, which is actually very important. But how does this apply to Warhammer? The Monothelites' presumptions can be applied to the Emperor of mankind. Let me remind you that time in the warp is unique, and any being that appears there even once has, in a sense, always existed. The universe has shown us that the birth of a new Chaos God from the Emperor is something that will happen sooner or later and is perceived as inevitable. And if that is so, then inside the warp, such a Chaos God already exists, has a domain, has a will, and influences the setting. At the same time, in the real world, time flows linearly, and the event that will trigger the birth of this new god has not yet happened, which means that the human emperor is still alive. So we end up with two emperors, the human emperor, who is caught between life and death on the golden throne, and the god emperor, who has not yet been born into the material world, but who already exists in the warp because of its nature. And of course, there is a natural conflict between these two subjects. The God Emperor in the warp wants to be incarnated in the real world. He influences the setting, he hears prayers, he sends miracles, but for this to happen, the human Emperor must die. He resists this, and for 10,000 years, he has been delaying the birth of the new Chaos God. As evidence, I want to point out that in the books, the first saint of the Emperor and her first miracles in the fight against demons appeared even before the Emperor learned about the betrayal. This can only be explained by the fact that the source of these miracles was the new Chaos God, who had not yet appeared in the real world, but already existed in the warp, and, unlike the human Emperor, was omnipresent. Moreover, even within a single book, we can see how different these two subjects are. In Guy Haley's Godblight, there is an episode where Guilliman, one of the resurrected sons, speaks to the Emperor personally. By that point, the Emperor had suffered on the throne for 10,000 years. This clearly affects him. His mind is divided, it's hard for him to form thoughts, and he says contradictory things. Later, however, the Emperor literally enters his son, heals his mortal wounds, and almost destroys the realm of another god. Further, in another book, in an episode where the Emperor sends a dream to one of his soldiers in order to deliver a short message, in this dream, he doesn't show the same signs of a shattered consciousness and doesn't seem to have difficulty expressing his thoughts, unlike in the episode with his own son. We see a clear contradiction in how the Emperor appears in these episodes. The level of power and the cognitive abilities are different. The best explanation for this inconsistency is that these were different characters, the dying human Emperor and the emerging God Emperor. I want to note that this interpretation of the two natures and therefore the two wills of the Emperor is not accepted in the fan community. You can treat it as my fan theory if you'd like, but I'm convinced that it comes directly from the general cosmological assumptions of this universe. The only channel where I've heard reasoning similar to mine is Sandman of Terra. At the same time, I fully realize that it significantly changes how the universe is perceived. It implies that the Emperor on the throne does not hear prayers and does not send miracles, or at least that not all miracles can be attributed to him. In some sense, my theory comes into conflict with another reading of the Emperor's lore, which really needs to be mentioned, at least briefly. On the YouTube channel Pontius, there is an excellent video about who the Emperor is and what the purpose of his existence is. I strongly encourage everyone to check out this foundational piece. In the video, the author argues quite convincingly that the Emperor is a weapon created by the Old Ones. The Old Ones are a mysterious Xenos race, possibly one of the first intelligent species in the galaxy, responsible for creating the Orcs, the Eldar, and many other sentient beings. According to this reading, in order to destroy chaos and return the warp to its former, relatively calm state, the Old Ones did not merely create the Emperor as a physical being, they literally engineered his soul as a weapon against the Chaos Gods. One of the supporting arguments is that the Golden Throne itself is a device created by the Old Ones, which potentially has the ability to cleanse the warp with its light. Humanity, in this interpretation, is also an artificially created species, endowed with psychic potential. The roles of humans is therefore to act as ammunition for the Emperor. By sustaining the throne, human psychers empower the Emperor created by the Old Ones and bring him closer to his original purpose, which is the purification of the warp. In short, it is a very interesting video. One of the authors of that video, who goes by the nickname Shock, read my analysis and left a number of valuable comments, for which I am very grateful. In the course of our discussion, it became clear that we do not agree on everything. That is completely normal in this kind of discussion, but at least one point of disagreement is worth addressing in more detail. What I interpret as a conflict between the Emperor's divine nature and his human nature, Shock interprets as a conflict between the Emperor's human nature and his nature as a weapon created by the Old Ones. In other words, when the Old Ones created a weapon against chaos, they did not account for the fact that once incarnated among humans, this weapon might develop purely human motivations, sentiments, and goals aimed at preserving the human species. These goals could come into conflict with the original design and directive of destroying chaos at any cost. From this perspective, even the scene of Gilliman's conversation with the Emperor, where the Emperor's mind appears fractured, is seen by Shock as a direct consequence of this internal conflict between the Emperor as man and the Emperor as weapon. I'm not sure how close this reading of the lore is to me personally, but I do understand the logic and the chain of reasoning that leads to such conclusions. Strictly speaking, I also do not think that our interpretations are necessarily mutually exclusive. So you, dear viewers, are free to choose the one that resonates with you more, choose both, or hand us both over to the Inquisition. The possibilities are endless. And since we've gone so deeply into Christian theology in relation to Warhammer and the Emperor, one very important point needs to be clarified. There is no God. At least not in Warhammer. Let me explain what I mean. When people analyze religions in Warhammer, they usually assume that this fictional world works the same way as ours at a fundamental level. For example, a Christian may automatically assume that the Christian God must also exist somewhere within Warhammer. This assumption may never be spoken or consciously reflected on. It may simply be taken for granted as a default premise. From there, the person begins to interpret everything that happens in Warhammer as if the Christian God is present. In my view, this is a mistake. Although I am myself an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I am convinced that in the Warhammer universe there is no Christian God. In fact, there is no single transcendent God at all. And the absence of such a God has consequences for how the laws of this universe work. This brings us to the transcendental argument. So what is this argument? In our world, it is used to argue not just in belief in God, but for the necessity of God's existence. The idea is that only God can serve as the foundation for universal logic, rational thought, knowledge, and so on. You cannot dig up the laws of logic from volcanic rocks. You cannot find mathematical axioms in DNA. Yet all these abstract categories are universal and do not depend on culture or personal preference. If such universal categories exist, then something must contain them. Matter cannot contain abstractions. Only a mind can. And the only mind great enough to contain all universal categories and connect them to the material world is transcendent God. For the purpose of this video, I'm simplifying the argument a lot. But the key point is, if there were no single transcendent God, then logic, mathematics, causality, and physical laws would not be absolute. They would vary depending on the subject. And this is exactly how the Warhammer 40k universe works.
I accept these burdens as an angel of the Emperor.
Humanity follows its own logic and physics. A human tank moves because of engines, mass, gravity, and so on. But why does a pile of scrap metal called an orc tank move? Nobody really knows. Imperial researchers studying orc technology concluded that it simply should not work at all. In fact, it doesn't work for anyone except orcs. Within the fan community, it is often said that orc machines function purely through the power of belief. I would argue that the situation is actually more complicated and much more fascinating. Orcs build machines according to physical principles that only they understand. If universal logic laws existed in Warhammer, then none of their stuff would function. The same applies to alien technology in general. Humans are forbidden to use Xenos technology for religious reasons, but there may also be a deeper reason. These technologies may be built on separate laws of reality. Studying them long enough could either drive a researcher insane or force them to conclude that nothing is truly absolute. So if there are no universal constants in Warhammer, there is also no single universal God. Not only the warp, but even matter itself can be changed by thought and will. If the laws of the material world can shift, then they stop being true laws. Reality becomes local and dependent on whose will is strongest. This idea will become especially important later when we talk about the cult of the machine god.
For the machine is immortal.
This idea, in its most extreme form, can be found in Isaac Asimov's novel, The Gods Themselves. In this story, humans make contact with a parallel universe and soon discover that it follows different physical laws. By exchanging unstable isotopes, both universes gain access to what looks like an infinite source of energy. The problem is that matter from the other universe also brings its own field of physical laws with it. Because of this, the laws of our own universe begin to balance and change. The result could be the explosion of our sun. It is such a cool idea that if it were up to me, I would copy it into Warhammer almost word for word. To sum it up, when I use Christian concepts and theological frameworks to analyze Warhammer, I do so in a strictly instrumental sense. I'm using the logic of theological reasoning as a tool, not arguing that the Emperor is Jesus. A similarity of imagery does not automatically imply a similarity of meaning. The theology of the Golden Throne is another interesting subject. Immediately, the analogy of the crucifixion comes to mind, and not only in the instrumental sense, as in both the throne and the cross are at the same time tools of torture and tools of salvation. There is also a mystical dimension to this, if you will. Basically, those last 5 minutes were there precisely to prepare you for this comparison. As has already been mentioned, one of the functions of the Golden Throne is to maintain the work of the Astronomicon, the beacon that makes space travel through the warp possible. Navigators follow the light of the beacon, while thousands of psychers with the Emperor burn out upon it every day, merging into a single choir. This powerful image is taken almost directly from hesychasm, a form of Christian teaching that is not particularly well known to Westerners. Hesychasm is a form of mysticism in Eastern Orthodoxy. When describing the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor, hesychasts focus on the divine light that his disciples saw at that moment. Hesychasts believed that an ascetic who achieved closeness to God could also contemplate this light and, in this way, reach the state of theosis. This means that, under the influence of divine grace, the nature of a human being is transformed and becomes like God. This teaching is often expressed by the phrase, "God became man so that man might become deified." Of course, a person does not literally become God in essence, but instead reaches true union with the Creator. Contemplation of the divine light is precisely the way to such deification. Hesychasts believe that, through the contemplation of the light, one can experience God through the divine energies. Warhammer takes this doctrine and turns it into a necessary element for the functioning of humanity. At the same time, the light of the Astronomicon is much closer to the way divine energies are described in the Old Testament rather than the New. Hesychasts believe that the vision of the Tabor light is absolute grace, but in Warhammer, the light of the Astronomicon is deadly for ordinary mortals and psychers. It is much closer to those parts of the Bible that are often associated with cosmic horror, like when God says to Moses, "No one may see me and live," or when different characters cannot physically bear the presence of the divine because of their sinfulness. This is partly explained by the fact that the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon are like the Transfiguration and the Crucifixion in reverse. In Christian doctrine, the Transfiguration and the Crucifixion are necessary parts of the process that leads to the ascension of Christ. But in Warhammer, remaining on the Golden Throne is not a step on the way to the Emperor's deification, it is an obstacle that prevents this ascent. The Emperor has delayed his transfiguration for thousands of years, which is why his light also has a destructive character. At this point, some viewers might say that Warhammer is, at its core, a deeply anti-Christian universe. This is a very Christian-centered way of assessing Warhammer. Hot take, not every work of science fiction that does not contain Christianity is anti-Christian. From my view, it is much more accurate and meaningful to say that the Warhammer universe is not anti-Christian, but anti-Gnostic. Gnostic religions divide reality quite strictly into the material and the immaterial. The material world is seen as fundamentally broken, and matter itself is seen as the source of evil. The creator of the material world is understood either as an evil demiurge or simply as an incompetent being. The immaterial realm, on the other hand, is viewed as the plane of existence through which one can unite with the true God, who exists somewhere beyond and does not take part in the life of material beings. The human soul is seen as a fragment of this true deity, and people are meant to free it from the prison of matter. Gnostics claim that the soul is the only truly good thing present in the material world.
Whilst even one of us lives, we fight.
The Cosmology of Warhammer completely inverts this view. In Warhammer, neither the material nor the immaterial world is evil by nature. Evil, as expressed in the Chaos Gods and Demons, is born out of the souls of living beings, what Gnostics see as the one fragment of the true good God within the material world becomes, in Warhammer, the very cause of the creation of the twisted Chaos Gods. If I were a Gnostic, I would probably be deeply offended. And just as with the word God, it is worth clarifying what I mean by the word soul. For the purposes of this video, I'm relying primarily on Descartes' idea of two substances, the thinking substance and the extended substance. The soul is the thinking substance, re cogitans, the bearer and center of will, desires, thoughts, and feelings. So far throughout the text, we have been looking at individual images and elements of Warhammer, but not at the narrative itself. However, the narrative also contains important elements that deserve a theological interpretation based on the conclusions we have already reached. Take at least the fact that the Emperor is a militant atheist. Almost from his very first appearance, the Emperor has been dismantling religious institutions step by step. During the unification of Earth and the Great Crusade, this process reached its peak. Religions were banned. The existence of gods was denied. This was the official doctrine of the Imperium.
We make ready for a war that may never end.
And this attitude did not apply only to ordinary subjects, it also extended to his own sons, from whom he hid the true nature of the warp and the existence of the Chaos Gods. The Emperor certainly knew about them, and at some point, he had even made a pact with the gods under unclear conditions. Only a small inner circle possessed the full knowledge of the Immaterium.
You stole power from the gods and lied to your sons. Mankind has only one chance to prosper.
People usually describe the God Emperor as a terrible father, largely because he hid the truth from his own children. Because of this, when the Primarchs encountered the beings of the Immaterium, they felt deceived, and humanity was unprepared for contact with the immaterial realm and literal demons. But this criticism is based on a wrong assumption. I did not begin this video with cosmology by accident. Let me remind you that there is no transcendent god in Warhammer, and knowledge about the warp and chaos spreads like a cognitive hazard. If we take these two facts seriously, the Emperor simply had no other choice but to hide information about the warp and to impose militant atheism as state policy. Since the Chaos Gods gain strength from human emotions, no matter what the Emperor does, they will become stronger, and any open information about the existence of the immaterial world and these gods only accelerates direct contact between chaos and humanity. It does not matter to whom exactly humanity prays. These prayers would still be heard by the Chaos Gods. The Emperor was forced to blind his followers, metaphorically speaking. Thus, if they do not at least pray, they will not be able to become a window through which creatures from the warp can penetrate the material world. There is an interesting moment in the rather mediocre 2014 film Dracula Untold, when the army of the Turkish Sultan is afraid to face the vampire. The Sultan orders his soldiers to blindfold themselves so they do not see Dracula's terrifying powers. In the film, this looks incredibly stupid. But a similar decision made by the Emperor in Warhammer is far more justified. The Emperor desperately needs to unite humanity to defeat chaos. But once humanity begins to learn en masse who the real enemy is, its chance of defeat immediately increase. Burdened by such knowledge, humanity could spiral out of unified control and quickly fall into heresy due to fear, ignorance, or carelessness in its handling of the warp. It's worth remembering that knowledge of the warp is a cognitive hazard. Leaving humanity in ignorance is truly the best solution. That is why the creation of a religion centered on the Emperor after his permanent enthronement is a problem. Not only does it contradict his supposed atheism, but a united human faith continues to strengthen chaos. It brings the Emperor's birth as a chaos god closer, which, as we already discussed, the human Emperor does not want. At the same time, although the Emperor is a militant atheist, he is still ready to use religion as an instrument to some extent. It is easy to notice that, for an atheist, he frequently uses religious symbolism. The Great Crusade did not have to be called a crusade at all if the goal was to eradicate all religious expression. And the extremely important historical event of the Council did not have to be held on a planet called Nicaea either. The Emperor not only tolerated such symbolism, but he even encouraged it. This contradiction may irritate some fans, but from a theological analysis viewpoint, it's not surprising. The Emperor has a faith-based expectation of his followers. He requires his supporters to be knights of faith. Reflections on what the Emperor wants are no less interesting than reflections on who he is. His work is important and mysterious, and his instructions are not always clear. His plan must simply be trusted without asking unnecessary questions. And fortunately for my analysis, one of the relatively recent updates to the lore concerns nothing less than one of the last orders the Emperor gave to his subjects. The Terminus Decree, a final order to be enacted only in a moment of extreme necessity and the most critical circumstances. Only if something truly dreadful and unforeseen happens. If the Emperor himself should ever attempt to rise from the throne, he must be seated back upon it.
Why do you look so afraid? Are you not happy that your god is returned? Or did you expect me to shower you in golden light? To be the perfect man, I am just a god that you made into being. And you made a cruel and merciless god.
This addition to the lore received a mixed reaction, but in my view, it is extremely interesting and important. It also brings back into relevance one of the Emperor's frequently reoccurring traits, which previously we encountered only in stories set in the distant past of the Warhammer universe. So in order to understand the meaning and premises of this final order, we need to talk about the Knights of Faith. Kierkegaard is a Lutheran existentialist philosopher. In his work Fear and Trembling, he formulated the concept of the Knight of Faith. In practice, it is a fancy name for the ideal believer. For Kierkegaard, a Knight of Faith is a person who can trust God absolutely, even when this trust contradicts common moral norms, rationality, their own understanding of the world, and the previously revealed will of God. Kierkegaard uses the example of Abraham, who was prepared to sacrifice his son, Isaac, even though it went against Christian ethics. For the philosopher, this moment reveals the essence of the Knight of Faith. The sacrifice Abraham was asked to make was, so to speak, pointless if we compare it to Greek tragedies where the gods demand the death of a child in exchange for some higher goal, such as victory in war. In Abraham's case, nothing is promised in return for his son. His sacrifice is supposed to be the act of a pure faith that persists even when purpose is unclear. Abraham's faith also contains two mutually exclusive positions. On the one hand, he believes that he is obliged to sacrifice his son and is ready to do so. On the other hand, he believes in God's covenant that Abraham will grow old, honored by a people that will come from this very son whom he is about to kill. That obviously could not happen if Isaac is dead. These positions contradict each other, yet Abraham believes in both. If we return to Warhammer, the Emperor often thrusts his followers into similar positions. Even before his anointment to the Golden Throne, he behaved like a god. He deliberately appeared before his followers, surrounded by radiant light, came to his followers in visions, worked miracles, created life, controlled matter around him, did not die, and so on. In short, he had all the qualities of a confident deity. Not a Christian-like god, but one similar to Odin. And while he demonstrated all these signs of godhood, at the same time, he demanded that ordinary followers deny what they saw and reject any religious faith or experience, even if that religious experience was sent to them by the Emperor himself. One of the clearest examples of this can be found in Graham McNeill's short story, The Last Church. In this story, the Emperor personally visits the last surviving church on Terra in order to destroy it. While it's never stated directly, the text hints that the church is something like a quasi-Christian community. The entire story is a debate between the Emperor and the priest about whether faith and religion are justified or whether they have any place in humanity's future. To be honest, the debate itself is rather shallow.
Like a stereotypical Reddit argument. Much more interesting are the details that come to light during the conversation. As it turns out, the religious experience that pushed the priest to become a devout believer had been sent by the Emperor himself. Moreover, the way the Emperor first revealed himself to the priest was almost exactly the same as how Jesus revealed himself to the Apostle Paul. Both appeared as a bright light before people who had literally been fighting against their followers. And both asked the same question: why do you reject me? The Emperor even added that he was the truth and the only way. It is impossible to imagine that the Emperor did not understand exactly which scene from which book he was reenacting, or how it would be perceived by his future follower. To appear in that specific way, rather than any other, was a deliberate choice made with full awareness of the consequences. At that moment, he specifically needed a believing follower for some purpose. The story ends when the Emperor succeeds in convincing the priest to renounce his faith. The church is set on fire, but at the last moment, the priest changes his mind. He sees that the Emperor is, in essence, a bloody tyrant prepared to commit atrocities. The Emperor may well want a future for humanity, and he may even know a path to humanity's salvation, yet the priest is not ready to walk that path. He refuses to follow the Emperor, even though he understands that the Emperor is right, so he returns to the burning church and dies within it. In this story, the Emperor is still a human being, yet, like the gods of the other religious systems, he demands that his followers reject familiar norms. From the Emperor's point of view, the question is simple: what is more important to you, me or your faith in me that you find so precious? For most religions, it's not enough to acknowledge that somebody is divine. It is not enough to simply believe in a god. In many religions, worship must follow predetermined guidelines. Only then is it pleasing to that god. In this sense, the Emperor is a tragic deity. The majority of his zealous followers claim to have absolute faith in him, but they worship him in a way he does not approve. This is crucial to the Emperor, so much so that he pauses his galactic crusade to deal with one of his misguided followers. The priest from The Last Church is not the only example of this, and not even the most important one. In the timeline, this episode foreshadows a similar situation between the Emperor and his son, Lorgar. Each of the Primarchs has immense power and a distinct character. One is basically a Viking, another is an engineer, one is a born administrator, and another is a sorcerer. Lorgar grows up as a natural ideologue, more precisely, a religious ideologue. He is the only one of the Emperor's sons who openly calls his father a god and goes against Imperial doctrine by worshipping him. While I won't go into all the details, this ends with the Emperor destroying a city that Lorgar had built as a worship utopia. Just like the priest in the story, Lorgar has visions of the Emperor long before their first meeting. And again, just like the priest, he ends up facing the same dilemma. Lorgar must decide what matters more to him, the Emperor himself, or the faith in him that he created. While the priest concluded that it was better to die with his faith, the Emperor's son reaches a different decision. For Lorgar, faith as a phenomenon is more important than any single god. If a god is unworthy of worship, that god must die. Kierkegaard was not the only philosopher who reflected on Abraham's egg. Another perspective comes from Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that morality and ethics are autonomous. They do not depend on the will of the gods.
From this position, he formulated what Abraham's correct answer to God's command should have been. Kant thought it ought to sound like this: I am certain that I must not kill my good son.
I am not certain that you who appear to me are truly God, and I cannot be certain of that.
Moreover, in Kant's view, Abraham even could be sure that the voice he heard was not the voice of God, because a command to do something that contradicts the moral law cannot come from God. If we bring Kant's view into the Warhammer universe, it further highlights the Emperor's tragedy. He continually asks his followers to act like Kierkegaard's Knights of Faith, yet he only receives Kant's answer. The Emperor is a rope stretched between Kant and Kierkegaard. To be fair, this phrase contains more pathos than meaning. I simply like how it sounds, and I've heard that to popularize a video, you must at some point reference Nietzsche. Let's move on. Fans may feel that the themes of searching for Knights of Faith has lost its relevance within Warhammer. It primarily connects to stories about Warhammer's past rather than the current timeline. Once the Emperor is on the Golden Throne and is widely worshipped as a god across the Imperium, his expectations for his followers might become more evident. This impression is wrong. To explain why, let us return to the contents of the already mentioned Terminus Decree. The Terminus Decree is a secret order given to the Grey Knights, a chapter of Space Marines made up of Psyker Astartes who specialize in hunting and destroying demons. They must carry it out if the Imperium stands at the brink of defeat. The chapter was created using the gene seed of the Emperor himself. It is small in number, but each member is extremely powerful and said to be incorruptible to chaos. The decree states, supposedly in the Emperor's own words, that if he ever attempts to rise from the Golden Throne, the Grey Knights must force him back onto it by any means necessary. In practice, this means a direct order to start a civil war and lay siege to Terra. The aim is to attack their own divine ruler. Within the fan community, this piece of lore is very controversial, mainly because this new development contradicts what was previously believed about that decree. Based on events in the books, it was assumed that the decree contained instructions to release a virus that would kill all genetically modified Astartes and Primarchs, both loyal to the Emperor and aligned with Chaos, if the Emperor's forces ever found themselves on the brink of defeat. The version of the Terminus Decree that has now been officially confirmed simply feels less well supported by the lore. It is also unclear how the Grey Knights could even theoretically carry out the task of forcing the Emperor back onto the throne if he were to decide to rise from it. This update also seems to turn the Emperor into one of the antagonists of the setting, but I'm analyzing the lore we actually have, not the version of the lore that we might prefer to have. In my view though, this development fits the pattern we have already seen. Once again, the Emperor asks the impossible from his followers. Once again, he is looking for Knights of Faith. At the same time, the content of the Terminus Decree indirectly supports my thoughts about the two conflicting natures of the Emperor. The birth of a warp god from the Emperor would be a catastrophe for the material universe. The solar system would almost certainly be destroyed in the process. No one can guarantee that the new warp god would be loyal to humanity or that he would want its survival in the same way that the human Emperor does. If the Emperor rises from the throne, that means he is already someone else. Someone who has gone through 10,000 years of torture. Someone whose mind has been shattered. Someone who has consumed millions of Psyker's souls, which were fed to him to keep him alive. Quite possibly someone who is willing to be reborn as a god. So, we have covered a lot of ground while analyzing the Emperor. We have looked at his two conflicting natures, at Orthodox mysticism and Knights of Faith, and at the idea that the warp god born from the Emperor already exists in the universe as a being separate from his human forerunner. There is only one question left that we have not addressed. What is the Emperor actually a god of? Fans have long argued over the extent of the Emperor's domain. To determine what the Emperor's domain looks like, we first need to decide how a Warhammer god's domain should appear. First, by a domain here, I mean the wellspring, the source of power and the main foundation for the existence of a Chaos God. If we look at the 4 central already existing gods of chaos, we see that each draws power from a certain kind of phenomenon. Slaanesh draws power from desire and excess, Khorne draws power from slaughter, Tzeentch draws power from deceit and schemes, Nurgle draws power from entropy and decay. It's clear that the Chaos Gods do not really care who strengthens their domain. Khorne does not care who dies in battle, whether it's his enemies or his followers. He will, in either case, become stronger through slaughter. Tzeentch has no problem with plots, schemes, and plans within plans that are directed against him. The only thing that matters is that someone keeps spinning those schemes, as this makes Tzeentch stronger. In the same way, Nurgle and Slaanesh do not care whose body rots or who gives into vice. I say all this to show that the domain of the God Emperor must also be universal. It has to be something that grows stronger regardless of who feeds it. So we can dismiss the obvious answers like the domain of the Emperor is humanity itself right away. We also set aside things like tyranny or hatred because every Chaos God is a hateful tyrant. I also do not think the answer should be sought in the etheric dominions of chaos. That image lists 8 domains, each of which is supposed to reflect a chaos deity, either already existing or potentially born in the future. At least, that's how fans usually interpret it. But I do not think that if the Emperor is ever fully born in the warp, that he must automatically become a new Chaos God. In discussions about Warhammer, people often do not clearly separate the terms Chaos God and Warp God, even though the difference is quite significant. Chaos is the name of a specific pantheon, but the Warp is not limited to only 4 gods. The setting mentions other warp entities that clearly have godlike status, yet do not belong to the Chaos pantheon. So the idea that if the Emperor becomes a warp god, he must instantly join that pantheon lacks support, which is why when fans look at the 8-pointed star of chaos and try to guess which of those destructive domains belongs to the Emperor, I honestly find myself puzzled. What makes you think that he'll definitely be there? Moreover, the image of the 8 destructive forces itself can be interpreted differently. For example, Shock, whom I've already mentioned, suggested an interesting idea while discussing this text with me. The 8-pointed star could actually describe the 4 Chaos Gods themselves, not 8. Each god is associated not with 1, but with 2 etheric domains. One domain reflects the corrupted side of a Chaos God, while the other reflects its more pure aspect. In this sense, each Chaos God consists of 2 halves, which fits well with the old lore that each Chaos God once had a constructive, uncorrupted domain. If we take all this into account, along with the whole Warhammer narrative that I am familiar with, then, in my view, the God Emperor is the god of sacrifice. Not of any kind of sacrifice, but of self-sacrifice in the name of a higher goal. The theme of self-sacrifice runs through the entire biography of the Emperor. He personally sacrificed many people in order to achieve his goals. The Emperor sacrificed himself when he ascended the Golden Throne, and he continues to function there only because thousands of Psykers are sacrificed to him every day. Whichever episode of the Emperor's life we take, sacrifice appears in one form or another. And only thanks to the sacrifices of trillions of soldiers and space marines does the Imperium still exist. At the same time, whom exactly the God Emperor helps through direct intervention doesn't depend on his anger or faith. His help depends on the willingness of a person to offer themselves as a sacrifice and to climb onto the altar voluntarily. And in my interpretation, if the God Emperor saves someone through divine intervention, he does so only because the sacrifice of that follower will matter much more somewhere else. For example, within the Emperor's personal guard, the Adeptus Custodes, there's a group of warriors known as the Aquilan Shields. Their task is to protect those servants of the Emperor who are destined to carry out some crucial role in the defense of the throne world. This may involve responsibility borne by such figures as generals or chapter masters of the Space Marines. but it can also concern ordinary soldiers, preachers, or saints who must die as martyrs at the right time and in the right place. The Emperor sends visions to his bodyguards revealing all such key individuals, and the custodians protect them precisely until the moment when their purpose has been fulfilled. This domain is also universal. It can be strengthened both by the self-sacrifice of a random guardsman and by the self-sacrifice of a Xenos. At this point, the Inquisition has probably already sent people after me, but I'm gonna meet with them with my head held high. In the end, all I ever wanted was the truth. I'm gonna allow myself a few words while the Inquisition checks my hard drive. It took me many months to make this video. The process honestly felt like a third job, so if you've made it this far, first of all, thank you. I hope you're enjoying my analysis. Second, please take a moment to leave a comment and share this video with anyone who might find this topic interesting. I realize that not every Warhammer fan wants to listen to long reflections about occultism, religious doctrines, and esoteric ideas. This video is definitely not for everyone. And of course, if you like what I'm trying to do here, consider supporting my channel on Patreon. The link will be in the description. On Patreon, I will occasionally post short notes about the progress of new videos and other things I find interesting. Right now, making these videos is a financial net loss for me. Do not get me wrong. I was ready for that from the start, and I'm gonna keep making them as long as I can. But it would be much more comfortable if I could at least break even. Even a small contribution would help. Let's continue. To finish my analysis of the Emperor and his place in the warp, I want to look at one more deity in the Warhammer universe, the Dark King. The Dark King is something like an ultimate warp god. There are many prophecies about his appearance, and the Dark King came incredibly close to manifestation during the Horus Heresy. Before the final duel, the Emperor realizes that he cannot defeat his son by his own strength because Horus has become incredibly powerful. So the Emperor draws as much power from the warp as he can and nearly transforms into the Dark King. We do not have even a rough description of the Dark King, but during the process of transforming into him, the Emperor took the form of a dark sphere that absorbs life. This transformation would give him absolute power, but the Emperor's personality would be dissolved in that power. Yet, in the final moments of the heresy, that transformation seems like the only way to win. At the very last moment, the Emperor refuses this power and decides to enter the final duel not as a god, but as a man. In order to have a chance at victory, the Emperor also casts any compassion in his soul into the warp. It is not entirely clear what the domain of the Dark King is, but it seems obvious that his appearance would mean the end of all sentient life, both in the material world and in the immaterium. On a personal level, I like to think that the Dark King is a single transcendent god. Not necessarily a Christian one, but a god with comparable qualities. I want to stress that this remains in the realm of theories and speculation. My views stand apart from the more popular readings on the universe. I do not think that the Dark King and the God Emperor who is forming in the warp are one and the same being. To me, it seems completely obvious that the God Emperor in the warp is born as a result of the constant sacrifices of humanity and is based on the part of the soul that the Emperor cut away from himself. The Dark King, in turn, is a much older being who could have manifested thousands of years before the Emperor's birth. Unlike the birth of the Chaos Gods, in order for the Dark King to appear, a sufficiently powerful material being must choose to take on his role. For some reason, he cannot simply appear. The energy needed for his manifestation must be channeled. The most interesting detail about the Dark King is whose emotions he is born from. While we have already concluded that everything in the warp is born through someone's psychic power, it is not obvious whose psychic could be powerful enough to create a warp god that would destroy literally everything. I have a theory about this. It is not supported by anything except my earlier analysis, but I am confident enough in it to present it in this video. In Christian theology, there is a concept called secondary causation. This term explains how created beings, brought into existence by God, have their own power to create. God created laws by which the world works, and he created subjects with free will who interact with the world according to predictable laws. Besides, what kind of free will would it be without the ability to act according to that will? This is simply the most logical consequence of Christian dogma. Although, of course, I hold this opinion partly because I approach the matter from the perspective of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. I can certainly imagine, for example, that there will be a group of Calvinists who would disagree with this conclusion. Soon after I became familiar with Warhammer, I was troubled by the question of whether the universe contains secondary causation. Not in the Christian sense, since there is no Christian God present, but in a sense that can exist only in this setting. In other words, if the Chaos Gods are the result of the psychic activity of living beings, can the psychic activity of the Chaos Gods themselves be the cause for the birth of a new subject in the warp? For a long time, the answer to this question seemed out of reach. However, the book cycle reached its conclusion, and I was finally able to read a full introduction to the Dark King. In other words, yes. From my point of view, the Dark King is a warp god created by the psychic activity of the Chaos Gods. This explains his power and why his manifestation is understood as the end of all other life. And this explains why his birth requires such an exclusive, even extraordinary condition. According to the rules of the setting, every life in the warp must have its starting point in the material world. Even if the psychic energy needed to create the Dark King was produced by the Chaos Gods themselves, someone in the material world must let it pass through so that the new god can be born. I understand that all this is pure speculation, clean as the tear of a starchild. These are my own theories, but this is the only way the existing lore can be explained without contradiction. This explanation makes sense of the Emperor's obvious dementia as well as the apparently contradictory concepts of the Star Child and the Dark King. It also intertwines things in the lore that at first glance appear inconsistent and mysteries that seemingly lead nowhere. I need to highlight something particularly important because it impacts how I carry out this analysis. In broad terms, there are two main philosophies for interpreting works of art. In one case, a work is seen as a tool for expressing the thoughts, ideas, and positions of its author. As a rule, schools and universities train us in this approach with the stupid question, what did the author want to say? I see this approach in many videos that discuss Warhammer. They focus heavily on the original intention of the writers and insist that something was meant as a parody of something else, and then the thought stops there, as if nothing more needs to be added. In my view, this line of thinking is a dead end, if only because the universe has clearly outgrown simple parody. Many of its elements have an internally consistent set of assumptions and reasons behind things that used to be read as caricature. In my analyses, I usually take the opposite approach. I treat the authors of works of fiction as tools. They are the bridge between the characters and us. The author is dead. He dies at the moment his work goes off to live its own life. It is not so important what the author wanted to say. That can be taken into account, but it is much more important what the work itself says. So when we talk about a story like Graham McNeill's The Last Church, I of course understand that, in this case, the writer is using the figure of the Emperor to communicate some ideas that seemed important to him at the time of writing. But when we analyze and try to rationalize the behavior of the Emperor in this story, not through the lens of the author, but through the context of all other events in this universe, we can discover new traits in this character that the author may not have planned, at least not consciously. The Emperor is more important and more interesting than Graham McNeill, with all due respect to him. Of course, my method also has its downsides, because not every interpretation will be successful, and the process of rethinking the meaning of a work can turn into a tool for cultural demolition. But that is not the topic of today's video. Maybe we will talk about it separately another time. For now, just keep in mind which school of analysis I belong to.
It's time someone gave me a straight answer here.
The next time we meet, the circumstances will be very different.
At this point, many viewers may start to wonder why, nearly an hour and a half into this video, I've not mentioned the official Church of the God Emperor. It is known under the names Adeptus Ministorum, Ecclesiarchy, or simply the Imperial Cult. The reason I've been ignoring it is simple and rather prosaic. There's not much to say. In terms of ideas, the Ecclesiarchy is one big juicy nothing burger.
We happy?
It's important to understand the Imperial Cult's theology before discussing it. However, the universe falls short of offering explanation. We know that this religion is based on a retelling of a book written by Lorgar, whom I mentioned earlier, before he fell into heresy. In the lore, we literally know only a few lines from this book. There are no other hints about the content or even the structure of the main religious text of the Imperium. The Imperial Cult also has 5 key truths. There is something like a creed, a minimum that everyone must accept in order not to be declared a heretic. Only 2 things in this list are interesting. First, submission to the state is a religious doctrine. This is a radical formulation of the concept of symphony between church and state that was developed in the Byzantine Empire. The second interesting feature of these 5 principles is that, outside of them, almost anything is allowed. The Nicene Creed is also a relatively short text that lists the main dogmas of the Church, but it is not treated as a sufficient minimum. Beyond it, there are many more dogmas and procedures. The Imperial Cult is not like that. Next to those 5 key principles, anything can stand, depending on the planet and its culture. For some, the Emperor is a star god. For others, something like a force of nature. You can worship the Emperor in almost any imagined form as long as he remains the only deity. As for religious practices, in some places human sacrifice is allowed within the church, in other places it is not, and so on. In short, the Imperial Cult is, of course, a totalitarian religion, dogmatic and all that, yet at the same time, it is surprisingly inclusive. Because of this, it's difficult to analyze it in any focused way or even describe it clearly. Inside it, there is such a wide variety of ideas that it is difficult to consider the faith unified. I like to think about the evolution of the religion of humanity in Warhammer as an interpretation of the French Revolution. One of the key parts of that revolution was the extreme anti-clericalism of its leaders, so they intended to completely abolish Christianity, but religious ideas were still seen as useful. So the obvious solution was to deify reason. The cult of reason was the main religion of the French Republic in those years. Basically, it was atheism raised to the level of religious fanaticism and mixed with revolutionary terror. At the same time, there were still holidays with a kind of quasi-religious nature, and the cult had its own martyrs, not of some deity, but of the revolution. So, the parallels with the atheist ideology imposed by the Emperor are pretty easy to see. But not everyone in France supported the cult of reason. One of its opponents was the revolutionary, thinker and executioner, Maximilien Robespierre. While Robespierre was not a big fan of Christianity, he also did not consider himself as an atheist. So, under his influence and the revolutionary terror, the cult of reason was abolished, and it was replaced with the cult of supreme being. At its core, it was basically Voltaire-style deism, a belief in some abstract god that does not really take part in human life. The supreme being could therefore be almost anything, as long as it fit a minimal set of dogmas, to recognize and worship the supreme being, to believe in the immortality of the soul, and, of course, not to go against the power of Robespierre, who at some point started to present himself as a religious figure. The parallels with the Imperial Cult are pretty obvious. The new religion did not outlive its prophet. Robespierre ended up getting his jaw shot during an uprising against him and was sent to the same place where he had sent thousands of others, the guillotine. After that, his remains were covered with lime. In the grim darkness of the French Revolution, there is only execution. Although, as mentioned above, the Imperial Cult bases its aesthetic on the Catholic Church, and the scale and industrialization of the terror are much closer to the Great French Revolution. Robespierre sent roughly the same number of people to their deaths in a month as Torquemada did during his entire time as Grand Inquisitor of Spain. This makes one wonder how inconsistently history is perceived in popular culture, but I digress. To sum up, I unexpectedly have nothing more to say about the Imperial Cult, unlike another organized religion in Warhammer for whose sake this whole material was originally written. I mean, of course, the Martian cult of the machine god. Most religions in the Warhammer setting share one very unexpected feature. None of them claim that their central deity created the universe. The Imperial Cult does not say this about the Emperor. The Orcs and the Eldar have their own gods as well, and neither of them seem bothered by the fact that their objects of worship did not create the world. This simply is not a topic for debate or reflection in any organized religion in Warhammer. The many chaos cults also do not insist that the gods of the warp are responsible for the creation of the material universe. At best, you sometimes hear about some kind of warp melody that underlies reality. A song made of the screams of countless tortured souls, but what that actually means in any practical sense remains vague. Only one organized religion in Warhammer clearly states that its god created the universe, and that is the cult of the machine god. The cult of the machine god, also known as the Adeptus Mechanicus, is a very strange hybrid in which you can find elements of Orthodox Christian doctrine mixed with, quite unexpectedly, elements of Islam. First, as before, we need a bit of lore context. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, the Emperor of Mankind fought a being known as the Void Dragon. This episode of the Emperor's life is still quite obscure, but its outcome is known with reasonable certainty. The Emperor won, but the dragon was not destroyed. Instead, it was captured and imprisoned in the Noctis Labyrinth deep beneath Mars. As for the dragon's origin, it is generally believed to be a shard of a Catan. The Catan were something like gods of the material universe. They lived inside stars and fed on stellar energy. During a conflict known as the War in Heaven, many of the Catan were enslaved by their former servants, the Necrons. But you cannot easily imprison a god, so the Catan were split into many shards. Each shard can exist on its own and still has its own will. The Void Dragon seems to have been one of the more powerful shards, one that specialized in technology and the manipulation of matter. At some point, it ended up on Earth and made the mistake of losing a fight to the Emperor. Mars was later colonized, and among its inhabitants, the cult of the machine god began to spread. The dragon, hidden in the depths of the planet, continued to influence the outside world by sending dreams and visions to the priests of Mars, mainly about how to work with machines. In that sense, the rise of the cult was almost inevitable. Under the influence of this religion, Mars became an incredibly advanced technological hub of humanity. Its industrial power was one of the key factors that allowed the Emperor to begin the Great Crusade to reunite mankind. Given what we discussed earlier, it would seem logical that Mars should have been brought into line just like any other world, and that its religious practices should have been wiped out, but that did not happen. Even though the Emperor was a militant atheist, he made an exception for Mars. The cult of the machine god was not only preserved, but the Emperor even inserted himself into it by taking on the role of a messianic figure. He arrived on Mars in accordance with its prophecies, performed miracles, and instead of conquering the planet, he made a treaty with it that guaranteed the priests of Mars autonomy and the right to keep their faith. This looks inconsistent and even hypocritical. Typically, the Emperor's actions are explained in two ways. First, the Emperor had no choice because he needed the industrial power of Mars. Second, the Emperor himself laid the groundwork for the cult of the machine god and knew in advance what would result from imprisoning the dragon on the planet. I've always found these explanations unsatisfying, because the risk of having a fanatical religious cult at the heart of the solar system, especially one with enormous military and industrial power, was simply too great. As we have already seen, in the Warhammer universe, any religious practice is a first step toward the Chaos Gods. In the book, The Master of Mankind, the Emperor himself explains his desire to destroy religion in exactly these terms. No matter who a believer thinks they are praying to, you can never be certain who is listening on the other side. This is probably where the deeper reason lies for why the Emperor ultimately created, preserved, and used the cult of the machine god. In this specific case, he knew exactly who was hearing the prayers of Mars, namely, the Void Dragon. The dragon's presence on Mars was both one of the reasons the cult formed and one of the reasons it could be safely maintained. It influenced the priests directly, which made it a kind of barrier between them and any other power that might otherwise hear their prayers. At least that interpretation seems logical to me. What do you think? When we discuss the theology of the cult Mechanicus, the first thing to note is that it believes in a Trinity. It is curious that the only religion in the Warhammer universe that resembles Christianity not just in form but in substance also insists that its God is the creator of the universe. I am sure this was not an intentional narrative choice, but the detail is hard to ignore. In any case, the Trinity of the Adeptus Mechanicus is not strictly Christian, only loosely similar. It consists of the machine god, the Omnissiah, and the motive force. In Mechanicus theology, the machine god is the ultimate source of all knowledge, technology, life, and physical processes. It is something like Laplace's demon, a being that can know and understand the position and velocity of every atom in the universe. In classical Christian theology, the material world is seen as the great creation of a God, the Father, and the human body is a temple. In Mechanicus theology, the body is also a creation of the machine god, but it is not made in its image. It is intentionally imperfect and full of flaws that must be overcome in order to approach the purity and holiness of what is truly close to the machine god, namely, the harmony of machines, the eternity of steel, and the beauty of gears and mechanism. The adepts of the cult Mechanicus see flaws and poor design in the material world. When they look at machines, they lack such flaws. They conclude that this kind of technological perfection is only possible because it was made possible by the machine god. This should not be confused with a Gnostic view of Christianity. In Mechanicus theology, the machine god is not evil or foolish, and the material world is not a prison to escape from. The theological shift away from Christianity is different. Christianity proposes fighting sin through spiritual effort, prayer, and religious practice. The Adeptus Mechanicus proposes simply cutting sin away altogether with the inefficient flesh. By improving their flawed design, an adept can also contain more knowledge. The value of an individual within the cult of Mechanicus is defined by how much knowledge they have accumulated. Since the human brain has physical limits, those limits can only be overcome through transformation and union with metal. The second aspect of the Mechanicus Trinity is the Omnissiah. The Omnissiah is understood as the physical incarnation of the machine god, and it is believed that the Omnissiah is the emperor of mankind. He is a kind of avatar through which the previously impersonal machine god entered the world it created. But honestly, this is the weakest part of the Mechanicus theology, as it doesn't really accomplish anything. In Christian theology, the incarnation of the Logos has a purpose and consequences. In Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, it is believed that Christ's blood washed over the skull of Adam on Golgotha, cleansing humanity from sin and making salvation possible. Christ also founded the Church, defined Christian teaching, and opened the path toward theosis. As Athanasius of Alexandria put it, he was incarnate that we might be made God. Humanity was given a path to approach the divine. If we apply the same logic to the Omnissiah in Warhammer, we should expect something similar. The machine god became flesh in imperfect form to reveal a path of salvation. The machine god became human so that humans could become like machines. But this does not really happen. The embodied machine god does not reject its own imperfect physical form, nor does it reshape the religious life of its followers. The Omnissiah does not introduce new religious practices, does not found a new church, and does not take part in the religious life of the cult in any meaningful way. Its concerns are mostly political and immediate, not theological. This disconnect explains why a large part of Mars never truly accepted the Emperor as a divine figure. The third aspect of the Mechanicus Trinity is the motive force. At first glance, it looks like an analog of the Holy Spirit, but not quite. By now, it should be clear that the Mechanicus Trinity does not consist of three persons, as in Christianity, but of three aspects or roles. There is no clear distinction between the machine god and the Omnissiah, and the motive force is not presented as a person at all. It is more like a divine quality, similar to how the Holy Spirit is understood in Judaism. But it is still amusing to imagine debates within the cult Mechanicus similar to those between Catholics and Orthodox Christians about whether the motive force proceeds from the machine god, the Omnissiah, or both. The motive force is also literally a force, which is important. This brings us to the Islamic influence on Mechanicus theology. One of the classic arguments for a transcendent God is the cosmological argument, also known as the unmoved mover. The universe is full of motion. Every motion has a cause. Therefore, there must be a first cause that itself is not moved, which is God. This argument goes back to Aristotle, though it has been reformulated many times. One example is its use in arguments for divine transcendence. The reasoning goes something like this. Everything in the universe has a cause outside itself. Therefore, the universe itself must also have a cause. That cause must exist outside the universe and beyond all of its dimensions. As a result, the first cause of the universe must be immaterial, because it exists beyond matter. It must be omnipresent, because it exists beyond space. And it must be eternal, because in order to be the cause of time, it must exist beyond time itself. Finally, such a cause must be omnipotent, because creating a universe requires that quality. A transcendent God fits this description. Of course, this argument can be criticized, like any other argument, but today's video is not about that. In Warhammer, the cult Mechanicus puts special emphasis on the idea that life is directed motion. This is the first of its 16 universal laws of Adeptus Mechanicus. If life is directed motion, then it must have a cause, something that sets it in motion, which is the motive force. The way Mechanicus theology is formulated leads to the conclusion that it leaves no room at all for secondary causation, which was mentioned around a half an hour earlier. Yes, of course you should have been taking notes. What did you expect? The absence of secondary causation for the inhabitants of the material world, or as members of the cult would put it, for mechanisms of flesh, might not seem like a big problem, but it radically changes how reality is understood. A similar conclusion was reached in the 11th century by the Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali. He argued that created things having their own independent power would undermine God's omnipotence. As an example, in this worldview, silk does not burn because of high temperature as it may appear, but because of God's direct intervention. What people call natural laws are not really laws at all, but simply the ways in which God chooses to govern the material world. Since God is a rational agent, he acts in a rational and predictable manner. Miracles, therefore, are not violations of natural law, but unpredictable divine actions that seem unusual to observers.
In this context, it is very interesting how time itself is understood within Islamic metaphysics. To simplify it as much as possible, the concept is roughly as follows. The whole world consists of atoms. This does not mean chemical atoms, but a philosophical concept. An atom is the smallest indivisible unit of the material world. Atoms have properties such as color, temperature, and so on, but they have no movement of their own. Every atom in the universe, at every moment of its existence, is in the place and condition assigned to it by God. Time, therefore, is a sequence of these constant moments of being. At each of these smallest moments, Allah personally destroys the world and immediately recreates it again. The easiest comparison is stop-motion animation. 60 frames per second together create the illusion of continuous movement through time. In reality, it is simply a very rapid change of images, each of which is static by definition. In Islam, or at least in the philosophical school of the Ash'arites, the entire material world functions in this frame-by-frame way, while Allah constantly maintains, so to speak, the sense of continuity of existence. Naturally, there can be no free will in such a system.
However, similar ideas are present outside of Islam. Descartes is quite literally a tech priest of the cult Mechanicus and probably the first follower of the machine god. There is no irony in this. Descartes was a proponent of mechanistic philosophy. He saw all living things, including the human body, as kinds of mechanisms, or self-moving machines. Human functions, in his view, could be measured and explained in the same way as the functions of machines, through the arrangement of organs, the flow of blood, the structure of matter, and so on. At the same time, besides the material component, these self-moving human mechanisms also possessed a spiritual principle. Descartes even proposed the existence of a specific organ in the human brain that would contain the soul. Even so, this did not really solve the problem. There is no necessary connection between body and soul. They are completely different substances, so they cannot truly interact. A solution to this contradiction was attempted by a second tech priest of the cult Mechanicus in human history, namely the Catholic priest, philosopher, and mathematician Nicolas Malebranche. His answer was that there is a mediator between soul and body, namely the all-powerful God. So if a person, for example, wants to move their hand, in Malebranche's view, God perceives the desire of the thinking soul and moves the material hand in space. Without divine intervention, a human being can't even move a finger or speak a word. A person would be motionless and dead if God did not align his will with the will of the human soul. Even sensory experience is sent by God. If someone pricks their finger, the feeling of pain is not caused by the object that pierced the body, but by God. These views are known as Occasionalism, in case you're curious. Another one for the notebook. It is not hard to make the bold assumption that the cult Mechanicus in Warhammer holds views that are at least similar, because its theology rests on the same philosophical foundations as those of Descartes and Malebranche. Peace be upon them and blessings of the Omnissiah. In some ways, the fictional cult of the machine god is even more consistent. If a human is simply a kind of mechanism, a self-moving machine that possesses a soul, then why not assume that all mechanisms must possess a soul? In its own way, this is logical. That is why the Theology of the Mechanicus includes the concept of the machine spirit, which is a fragment of the will of the machine god granted to every mechanism as a blessing. All technological devices, no matter how small, have their own spirit bestowed by the Omnissiah. How well a device functions or whether it malfunctions depends on the mood of that spirit. To keep a machine benevolent and cooperative, its users perform a vast number of rituals and maintenance procedures whose complexity depends directly on how intricate the technology is. To break a ritual is to break with faith. This perception of technology resonates quite well with the Buddha's teaching of the womb of the thus come one. According to this teaching, all beings can become Buddhas because each already contains a certain Buddha nature. It only needs to be revealed. When combined with Eastern animism, this also includes tools and machines. On the screen right now, by the way, is footage of workers at a Japanese factory saying farewell with gratitude and tears in their eyes to industrial machines that had completed their service before being scrapped. The factory director is also performing a purification ritual. This immediately raises the question of whether the emotions of machine spirits have a reflection in the warp, but I suggest leaving that to consultations with your local specialist from the Inquisition. It is interesting that the cult of the Mechanicus even has its own analog of the Eucharist. In Eastern Orthodoxy and in the Roman Church, this sacrament is understood as a process of transubstantiation or mitusiosis. That is, bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ at the level of substance as a result of the descent of the Holy Spirit, while the qualities accessible to the senses remain unchanged. In the cult of the Mechanicus, electricity plays a role similar to that of bread and wine. For obvious reasons, electricity is a key element in the ritual of activating machines, and this process takes the form of a sacrament. During this rite, the motive force descends upon the machine through electricity. The machine takes on the qualities of the motive force at the level of substance, while all other observable properties remain the same. Taking all this into account, it becomes much clearer why the cult forbids the creation of artificial intelligence. Within this theology, AI is something that moves itself without the blessing of the machine god, without a machine spirit, and without the participation of the motive force. Implicitly, this undermines the entire theology and either destroys the philosophical foundations of the cult or elevates AI to divine status, since it will be capable of moving itself. Although, it is worth emphasizing that Mechanicus theology may deliberately mislead its adherents. There is an opinion that the so-called machine spirits are in fact artificial intelligences embedded in all Imperial machinery. The tech priests simply do not realize this because they do not fully understand the principles behind what they create. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a definitive answer as to where the truth actually lies.
Spirit of this machine, heed me! Let thy fears be at peace, and perform my will!
Well, over the course of today, we have learned a great deal about the theology of the cult of Mechanicus. We've examined what its Trinity consists of, explored its connections to Islamic ideas and to Descartes, and even looked at its theology through the lens of the cosmological argument. While that is a lot to cover in one video, there is still one more topic I saved for my most patient viewers. I have concluded that it is precisely through the cult Mechanicus that we seem to be able to identify the official icon of the Emperor. The Emperor's victory over the dragon remained in human memory and was later reinterpreted through the images of the Archangel Michael defeating the dragon and Saint George also defeating a dragon. This image, applied specifically to the Emperor, appears several times in the book series, such as in the already mentioned short story, The Last Church. But I want to draw special attention to the cover of the novel Shadow of Treachery. On one of the Space Marine shields, we can see an imagery that looks very much like an icon. It is assembled from many fragments of different icons of St. George. This means that with a high degree of confidence, we can conclude that the cover depicts an icon of the Emperor as the slayer of the Void Dragon. In addition, there is the emblem of the Byzantine Palaiologus dynasty, the double-headed eagle, which is also the emblem of the Imperium of Man. The Palaiologoi were the last imperial dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. Their rule began with the expulsion of the Crusaders from Constantinople and ended with the city's capture by the Turks. Their reign marked both the last cultural renaissance of Byzantium and its final decline and collapse, which is a powerful and very fitting symbol for Warhammer. And since we're talking about icons, unfortunately, there is no clear evidence of which saints are depicted on the cover of the first book of the Horus Heresy series. But only two suitable candidates come to mind among those traditionally shown together in icons: Saint Athanasius and Saint Cyril. Both were famous for their struggles against Christian heresies. Saint Athanasius opposed Arianism, and Saint Cyril opposed Nestorianism. It is not entirely clear what meaning these two figures or their equivalents would have within Warhammer, especially during the period of militant atheism in the Imperium, but perhaps that is not so important. Not every question needs a definite answer, and sometimes the very act of asking the question already has value. As for why these icons are covered by a barcode in the printed version, this is most likely a layout issue rather than a problem with the artwork itself. The barcode was simply placed over that part of the cover during the design process. This may be exactly why you are hearing about this detail for the first time from this video. Of course, Warhammer is not a perfect universe. It is full of contradictions, especially in recent years, and there is plenty to criticize. And as its popularity has grown, it even seems to have lost some of its grim atmosphere. But for now, it is still capable of igniting curiosity and encouraging people to learn more, to analyze, to reflect, and to argue. Its heroes walk through the valleys of the shadow of death and do not fear evil. Perhaps that is why this universe of endless war resonates with so many people. Well, thank you all for watching. Since the first video on this channel went up, we are now at about 8,000 subscribers, so I can say with some confidence that I actually have accumulated a real, living audience. This was a difficult video for me at every stage of its production. I hope it was worth the time spent and that you did not come away disappointed. With this video, I wanted not only to introduce new people to Warhammer, but also to reopen this universe for those who are already deeply immersed in it. I wanted even someone who has read dozens of books and painted hundreds of Warhammer miniatures to watch this video and feel as if they're hearing about this universe for the first time. That goal, of course, meant that the video mostly consists of discussions of esoteric, theological, and philosophical concepts of varying complexity. I fully realize that someone not in the know might think all this is completely insane. Why bother trying to understand this at all? That is a question I asked myself many times. The answer is simple. I do not know, but for some reason, it feels important. And I'm doing this for those of you who feel the same way. I honestly tried to come up with a smarter answer, but I couldn't, so I settled on an honest one. I also want to thank everyone who took part in editing the script and checking it for lore inconsistencies. First of all, the already mentioned Shock, but also Detrick, Devin, Nathaniel Kane, and Jack. Thanks to all of them. I significantly reduced the chances of saying something outright stupid in this video that I would be endlessly embarrassed about later. All that remains is heresy and that kind of thing I'm not ashamed of at all. The next video is already in the works, and it's going to be about how to create a fantasy religion in a way that does not turn them into copies of Christianity or yet another predictable variation of the Catholic Church. Let me also remind you once again about Patreon. If you have the desire and the means to support what I am doing, I would be grateful. Some people have also suggested that I start a Discord server, but I'm still thinking about it. I'm not sure what it should look like or how many people would actually be interested, so it would be helpful to hear from those of you who made it this far. And in general, leave comments and share your thoughts. I read absolutely everything and try to reply. Once again, thanks for watching, and may God bless you.
In blood, we are born. And in battle, we are remade.
Ave Imperator. Ave Imperator.
Lord Commander, Skrull will threaten the Imperium no more. The Orcs are destroyed. Your leadership will be remembered when the name Volistad is spoken. Hail to the Emperor.